Hey everyone. A couple of months ago, I watched The Dark Crystal. You may have heard of it. An 80s fantasy flick made by the same people that brought you The Muppets, and it's awesome. The set pieces, the music, the atmosphere, and the general tidal wave of creativity that bursts from every corner of this film is nothing short of wonderful. It's short, sweet, and thoroughly rewatchable. Nearly 37 years later, and apparently there was enough demand for another Dark Crystal title to be made, this time in the form of a 10-part Netflix series. I don't doubt that there's an audience out there. Hell, you convinced me to sit through the whole season because I liked the movie that much. I was, however, left bewildered by how inconsequential the whole thing was and by how bored I became as the show went on. Today I'm going to tread back through the murky waters of Thra to praise the show for its unique qualities and attempt to explain why I thought this season dragged on a bit. So, without further ado, let's get on with the review. Just as with the film, the antagonists are one of the highlights of this series. If you couldn't get enough of the Skeksis' grotesque activities and ugliness from the film, then you're in for a treat this year. With the Gelfling being not quite wiped out yet, we get to see the full extent of their cruelty towards this race of elves. When watching them consume essence, it's hard not to wince, considering it once belonged to a living creature shown on screen, especially with the sudden death of Mira in the first episode. Say, doesn't the girlfriend of the protagonist die in the first episode of The Boys as well? I'm sure it's purely coincidental, I just wish they didn't keep showing her death again and again as though we're likely to forget it happened.
It is happening again. It is happening again.
Perhaps the best aspect of the Skeksis' cruelty, however, is when it's directed at their own, and more specifically how they treat Skektek. My god, that scene when the spider plucks out his eye was absolutely frightening, even for something with a PG rating. I had never thought to ask how the scientist got his light bulb eye, but the show answered a question I never thought to ask, so I was impressed by the writer's foresight. His continued bullying whilst being threatened to continue production of Essence provides uncertainty as to whether we should feel sorry for him or not.
The only mercy I have left to offer is death.
Okay, maybe not. Mark Hamill definitely stood out as being the best voice actor of this very high-profile selection. The Joker-esque voice fit the character he played perfectly. He kills it throughout, and the peak of which comes when the Emperor forbids him from joining the fight in the final episode. His roaming about the castle pretending to be the Emperor felt very deserved and satisfying. Sadly, the same can't be said about the creation of the Garthim at the end. I would have liked to have seen more of them in the series, as they were a highlight of the film, but instead are used as a teaser for a potential second season. This sucks. One thing I have no end of praise for, though, is the level of ingenuity and artistic devotion the design team put into this project. They successfully carried on Henson's legacy, respecting and honouring the hard craft and imagination of those that worked on the original film. It goes above and beyond this too, though, like the giant carriage powered by the giant worms forced to roll along like wheels, showing no limits to the Skeksis' cruel imagination. When Rianne, the main character, gets rescued from Chamberlain's clutches, the carriage gets thrown into the air and looks bloody spectacular. Seeing them released into the wild was thoroughly satisfying too. Likewise, Lore was a brilliant addition to the world. A beautiful construction with 3 operators that were chroma keyed when I was expecting the whole thing to be entirely CGI. The set designers had their work cut out too. Take the library set for example, which looks incredible until the CGI Bria runs up the stairs. In the original, whenever puppet limitations were met, human actors would step in to make the flow of the scene continuous. In this series, there are 0 humans of any kind, and any tricks like the ones in the film are replaced by CGI, which I think was a bad move. The worst of this trickery is seen when the hunter fights Rianne and his father in front of that pit of gobbles. It is so hard to make out what exactly is happening once he bursts out of the pit and takes Rianne with him. I had to re-watch this section because the quick cuts and blur made it difficult to establish what had happened. God knows how the hunter cheated death as well, but he also does it in a later episode when he once again escapes death and takes a Gelfling with him. Another time this happens is Rianne getting rescued from the carriage. Whilst I praised its conclusion, how we get there is fairly problematic. The backdrop firstly looks like Return of the Jedi's Endor speeder sequence, aka awful for 2019 standards, and then there's the lens flares, the dust flying up onto the screen, and a ridiculous amount of blur. Almost as though what they'd shot looked bloody awful and were trying to hide that fact.
You watch the show and you forget you're watching puppets. And if we do this, if we achieve that, this might be onto something.
Wait, sorry, what? You think that scenes like this are going to make the audience forget they're watching a puppet show? Well yeah, and speaking of terrible backdrops... Look, the movie is just as guilty of having bad backdrops, and hey, not all the CGI was bad, it just contrasts really badly with all the puppets and sets that have evidently had hearts and souls poured into them. The best uses of CGI are when it's subtle or seemingly moulding into the background. Take these animal locks for example. One unlocks Law's chamber and the other locks away a bottle of essence, but sadly a few bad apples spoil the batch. The world building approach leads us to having a lot of stuff to introduce in the first episode, such as the clans, and it's clear there's a change of pace as a result. Where the film really took its time and allowed the audience to soak up every little detail, the series jumps from one location to another in order to build this world, the foundations of which were written in a series of prequel novels by J.M. Lee. With the radical successes of franchises like Game of Thrones and the Marvel Cinematic Universe, producers are probably wise to jump on these bandwagons whilst they're still fresh in our minds. With reference more towards the former, this show does have a ridiculous amount of similarities to it, and I'm not entirely sure this is for the best. You look at the first 2-3 minutes of the first episode, and it is eerily similar to the design of the opening title sequence of Game of Thrones. The inclusion of voice actors like Lena Headey and Natalie Dormer also took me right out of the story. You also have a giant tree at the edge of the world that passes on its magical all-seeing powers onto one of our protagonists just as it gets destroyed by the unstoppable force of the season. And god, there's nothing quite as Game of Thronesy as killing off the king, or in this case the All-Mordra, and having their tyrannical child take over in their stead. The latter example, however, had less expected consequences. I love that scene where all of Celadon Skeksis bootlicking gets flung right back in her face. She spent all that time ditching the other Mordorers, defiling her mother's burial, and betraying her own siblings for nothing. This is probably the greatest strength of making this series a prequel instead of a sequel. It felt very much like a tragedy in waiting, with this resistance among the clans building up before their inevitable demise. We sadly don't get given everything though. Like Game of Thrones, not all the clans are given a formal introduction, and some are near enough inconsequential. After the second episode, I was expecting all of the clans to get some form of exploration in each episode, as the segment with Bria visiting the Sifa clan and nearly getting drugged was one of the best scenes in the series. Sadly though, the Sifa clan don't have much more significance in the rest of the series, and neither do the others really. There's the one with the giant flying stingray. Can't say I remember who they were. What transpires is that the more characters come together in a big clump around the middle of the series, the less development they get. In fact, most of the non-Skeksis characters left little to no impression on me whatsoever. It must be a real challenge to make puppets look emotional when the voice actors are doing most of the work, but the choice to make the Gelfling CGI was always on the table, at the cost of not being in the same spirit as the original film. With the film as well, you only had 2 Gelfling characters, but with Age of Resistance there are just countless amounts of them, some difficult to differentiate from one another, like the 3 daughters of the All-Mordra. Rian, for one, didn't have me rooting for him at any time, for his task was to tell everyone in Thra that the Skeksis are a bad thing, which was kind of a given anyway. Like I said earlier, if he actually explored the rest of the clans, them all showing up at the battle at the end might have felt more deserved. Instead, he just runs into Gelfling that never seem capable of justifying why they like the Skeksis so much. They always harp on about how much the Skeksis have given them, but never go into much detail about what exactly this is. A similar thing happens with Deet, another rather forgettable protagonist, and her annoying sidekick Hup, who, for the most part, wander around the wilderness of Thra and witness base-level racism from other Gelfling. It's hard to support this overarching theme of unity over division when most of the populace are just dickheads.
Oh, snow! What is snow but a grotto? Where is she? Oh, God, this great show!
Move, podling!
Oh, the Gelfling here are also different.
Yeah, rude!
With all this in mind, I was expecting the show to explore a theme like tribalism. It would have been really nice if we truly saw the Skeksis unleash plots to get the tribes to fight against one another, so we could know what they all stood for and what made them unique. This would also then make a theme of control flourish too. I, for one, find this a very fitting theme, considering the show's characters are all puppets who genuinely have no will of their own. The only snippet we saw of this lack of control was when the Arathim took hold of the Stonewood clan.
I am the Ascendancy.
I am the Ascendancy.
I'm Spartacus! I'm Spartacus!
The final thing I want to talk about is the ending, which really Mr. Tickled me up the wrong way. It starts off really great. The Skeksis look awesome in their battle armor, and the fight between the General and Rianne was slow enough to see what was going on. The twirl was super cool too, but once this initial duel was over, the battle just turns into a total cringe fest. The female Gelflings start flying and dropping bombs that land everywhere but on the Skeksis, who are just standing there. Stationary. How could you possibly miss them? Then all this fun stuff grinds to a halt just because Mordra Farah needs a blubbery moment for her death. It's not like I don't like the character, it's just that by the end of the episode, death becomes pretty meaningless, and so this moment had no dramatic weight. Firstly, because we know that the Gelfling are all going to die eventually anyway, and for a moment as well, I thought that Deet was going to inadvertently kill all the Gelfling with her purple lightning bolts. What a twist that would have been. Secondly, the hunter rolls around and Aughra just bursts out from within for some reason. Why this absurd Star Wars-esque notion that
no one's ever really gone
has landed itself in a show where the majority of the creatures will be wiped out by the end, I do not know.
But the fallen are not truly gone.
Just as all the other clans show up in the nick of time, the Skeksis are scared into running away. These clans have literally come from all corners of Thra to join up in the fight, and then they decide not to fight at all. How did the Skeksis even get away if these clans are surrounding them from all sides? The Gelfling who are suddenly convinced their leaders are corrupt and hungry for Gelfling
Essence.
just don't care that they've run away and escaped justice? I mean, Christ, none of them bar Rianne even cared that Deet just vanishes either. Not even Bria cared. She's too busy getting us hopeful for a second season. Hopeful that the Gelfling might survive. Well, dear, you're in for a shock because, spoiler, your resistance is gonna get crushed, and I don't even care to see it. So, did it suck? Not entirely. At times, it was thrilling, but this show is nowhere near as perfect as everyone else seems to think it is. I totally acknowledge the amount of work that goes into making something like this, but it seems to be overly ambitious and probably should have been just a mini-series or a Lord of the Rings length film. Most of the episodes are bloated with empty scenes, and this series probably would be more suitable for background entertainment at best. Thanks for watching. I'm going to review Years and Years next, and then we have part 2 of Disenchantment to dissect the week after that, so I'm going to be a very busy boy. Check out my Patreon page if you want to support the work that I do on here. What did you think of the Dark Crystal reboot? Leave a comment below or join us on my Discord server, where we will continue this discussion.